Basically, my goal is to go through maybe 5 or 6 different pop-up models and kind of talk about the fundamentals of pop-ups and just give you a little bit of a background. Let's take a look first at this little stack of stock that you all have right here. Go ahead and grab one of these sheets if you haven't already. You know, this is just 8.5 by 11, 110-pound cardstock. And bought it at Office Max. This is a great material for making pop-ups simply because it's thick enough that it has enough body to it. It'll remain rigid and it'll hold itself up. It'll maintain structure. But it's flexible enough that you can fold it and it makes an easy hinge. It's also great material to draft with because it's very cheap and I don't feel guilty about tearing through piles of it at a time as I'm working. Because cardstock is not necessarily easy to get your hands on in more interesting colors. For example, Ann mentioned that I brought a book. This is one of the books that I brought along with me. You know, here's the first spread. It's a book of pop-up flowers. You know, these are colors that you can't necessarily find in the weird pastel cardstock package that you can buy at the office supply store. So there's actually a place online where I go to buy the cardstock that I use for the finished artwork. But this, great for practice, great for drafting, and I do all of my sketching essentially in 3 dimensions because it's kind of the only way you can do it when you're building pop-ups. You just play with the materials. So let me have you all grab this sheet, and I want you to cut it in half in the short dimension. And I know not everyone has a self-healing mat that they're working against, and that is fine. I'm going to talk about some of the advantages of using a self-healing mat just for later, interest as well. When I'm cutting material, pretty much all of the time I'm using a knife to do it. You can get a cleaner, straighter cut with a knife. Lots of you are design students or art students, you know this already, especially if you're cutting against a straight edge. I do a lot of my measuring with the mat. It goes faster oftentimes to measure using the grid on the mat. And also because accuracy is so important in building pop-ups, that if I can square a sheet up into the mat to cut, it just helps me to keep things parallel and perpendicular and squared up and clean. So I'm going to line up my piece of cardstock into the mat. Let me encourage you to do the same. If you're working on mat board, just tuck that in your pocket for later knowledge. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you folks will just need to measure over before you cut. So here's my half sheet now, after I've cut this in half. Take this half sheet now and fold it in half. Match corners. I'll then use a bone folder and run a bone folder over the fold to make that fold very crisp. And so what we have now, we refer to as a folio. Folded piece of paper is a folio. A few quick anatomy of the folio review words here. If you're looking at your folded sheet, you've got your spine side of the folio, just like the spine of a book. On the opposite side, we have the foredge of the folio, the open side. The top, or also the head, the bottom, also the tail. If we open the folio, we've got the center fold, and we refer to that as the gutter. Also in pop-ups, oftentimes we refer to that surface of an open folio as the base, mounting into the base. So if you hear me say base, I'm just basically talking about that inside surface. All right, we're going to make, in our first two pop-up structures that we're going to make, we're going to take a quick look at the two fundamental directions that you can take when you're building with pop-ups. And one of them is called parallel fold structures, and one of them is called angle fold or V-fold structures. And once we make them, I'll talk about why they're called what they're called. So in order to make our first parallel fold structure, and I should tell you, you're going to have very little creative latitude over the next 2 hours. So here's your chance, bust it out, do something exciting. But here are the rules. You're going to draw 2 lines, and I have just freehanded in those 2 lines with my pen. I want you to actually measure them and square it up into your sheet so that these lines are parallel to each other. The lines are touching the spine side or the folded side of the folio. They're both the same length, and the lines do not go more than halfway across the page. So within those parameters, let me have you draw 2 lines, kind of like what I've got here in the model. Once I've got those 2 lines drawn, I'm going to lay my ruler down against the line. Again, I'm going to have the folio squared up on my mat, being careful to cut lines that are perpendicular to the spine. And I'm cutting on both of those lines, and I'm cutting through both sides of the folio all at once. So now that looks like this. 2 parallel lines, both perpendicular to the spine. They don't go more than halfway across the page. I just drew those lines that I cut as solid lines. That's kind of a convention in paper craft, both in pop-up engineering, also origami. Maybe some of you guys have done some of those things before. If it's a solid line, you know you're supposed to cut on it. If it's a dashed line, you know you're supposed to fold on it. So as a result, I'm now going to put some dashed lines onto this model here. I've just freehanded those in on either side of the folio. Let me go ahead and have you do the same. Basically just running between the two ends of the cut lines. And I'm going to score on both of those dashed lines. And it's quite likely that all of you have scored material before. We know that most commonly we score with a blunt material like a bone folder, like a stylus, like a ballpoint pen that doesn't have ink in it anymore. Those are all great scoring tools. And basically if you're going to score material, you'll lay a ruler down, and then you'll run your bone folder or whatever blunt end instrument against the ruler, and you'll make a little bit of a dent into the sheet. And in doing so, it makes it easier to fold the sheet, especially if it's something like cardstock that's more likely to buckle or crack when you fold it. Also, scoring the material first makes that point of the fold very accurate. It's once you score, it's hard for the paper to want to go and fold somewhere else. And again, when pop-ups get more complicated, accuracy really matters. All that being said, actually in pop-ups, I do not score with my bone folder, but I instead score with my knife. And I'm going to do a quick little illustration for you to explain the reason for that. Here are two cross sections of cardstock, the material I'm holding right now. Imagine that on this top cross section, I just took my bone folder and drug it across the sheet. I made this dent in the sheet. As a result, it's kind of dished out. We're going to have a little bit of compression of fiber underneath where we just drew that bone folder across. And it's good. It's good to score with the bone folder. But the knife is superior because if I score with a knife, I have a much finer, smaller, more accurate position for the scoring. And if I'm being careful, and we'll have to, and I don't go all the way through the sheet, I can vary the depth of the scoring with the knife. If I score a little deeper, it's a looser hinge. If I don't score quite so much, it's a tighter hinge. And again, with more complicated structures, that can be useful. If you do score too far, we can remedy that. So let me have you go ahead, go at it slowly. Sometimes you really don't need much more than the weight of the knife itself, dragging it across the surface of the sheet. So I'll give it a couple of light passes, just starting to cut into the surface of the sheet. So I just did that on the front side of the folio, between the two cut lines, on that dashed line as I've drawn it here. And then I'm going to flip the folio over and do the same on the back. So if I open this back up, and you can see all the way across the back of the folio, there are my two dashed lines, and I've just scored on both of those dashed lines. When you're scoring with a knife, essentially you always want to score on the mountain side of the fold. Of course, if we look at our folio here, here's the mountain side of our fold. It kind of looks like a mountain. It makes sense that this is the mountain side. If I were to flip it over, here's the valley side. Again, it kind of makes sense. It looks like a valley. That's the valley side. If we're scoring with a knife, we're always going to score on the mountain side. The fold is cleaner. We've done exactly that just now in scoring in these two positions. So let me have you go ahead and pinch on those two score lines. So we break the folds on either side. We'll reverse the fold and the central part of our folio here so that our structure pops forward. And then once we get it started, we can close the folio all the way down, hit all those folds with our bone folder to make them crisp. And this is our first pop-up. It's a parallel fold structure. The 2 points of attachment of our structure run parallel to the gutter. That's all there is to it.